Welcome back everybody to another episode of Motorvlog Vlogs. And if you remember from the last episode, I was out on this, the Royal Enfield Himalayan 450, giving you my first impressions and, telling you what it feels like to ride out on the road. Now, one of the most common questions that came up in the comments of that video is whether this engine is too vibey. It's something that people have read in some of the other reviews, and a couple of people had actually been out and tested this bike and found that themselves. So, this is going back today, but I thought I'd do a fairly comprehensive take on how vibey it is by showing you a couple of different scenarios and different riding speeds, and also with these rubbers out firstly, then in, and also we're going to try another 400cc single from another manufacturer and see how that compares to give us a bit of a benchmark. Now, like I say, we're going out first without the rubbers in, so that should be the most vibey setup. This is what you'd run it like if you were off-road to get some extra grip on these pegs. And I should say, I'm wearing some fairly chunky adventure-style boots, which is realistically the sort of thing that people are going to be riding this bike with, as opposed to more of those like trainer-style motorcycle boots. And ultimately, we're trying to answer the question, is this reason enough to not buy a bike that's otherwise, really quite good, especially when you consider the value for money? Now, I always think it does depend a little bit on how you ride with your feet on the pegs. I tend to have them with the ball of my foot on the sort of front edge of larger foot pegs like this, which is very much like a road style riding position, as opposed to flat on them on the middle of your foot, which you might be doing when you're off-roading, because then you can transition more quickly between seated and standing. But so far I would say it's not terrible at sort of 1, 2, 3 up to 3.5, 4,000 RPM. And so for cruising around at city speeds like this, or urban speeds, let's say, even without the rubbers in, I wouldn't say it's too bad. And even on a road like this that gets up to 40, 4th, 5th gear, it's not revving that hard. And it is quite a nice torquey engine, so you don't really need to use the revs. Knock it down into third though when we get up to 60 here. And when it's up to 6,000 RPM, and 7, it is a little bit more noticeable. That's when you start to feel it. Thing is though, those little accelerations are generally quite short, and so I think it's bearable, just for a quick burst to overtake or get up to speed before you knock it into a higher gear to cruise along. This could all change though on the motorway. If it's revving too hard, if it's revving in 6th at 70 miles an hour up over that sort of 4 to 4,500 RPM mark, then I do understand that it probably will be a little bit irritating. Now, some of this is down to where you're coming from as well. If you've been riding a single cylinder bike, you're probably used to quite a bit of vibing away. Whereas if you're riding a twin or something at the moment, then naturally this is going to feel a bit less smooth and refined. So we're on the motorway and doing 60 in 6th gear. We're revving at just under 5,000 RPM, and I would say it's tolerable. The seat isn't too bad. The bars are a little bit more vibey, and of course with those rubbers out I'm feeling it most through the pegs. Inch it up to 70 though, and it is getting up to that 5,500 RPM mark, and that is where you can feel it in a more pronounced way through the pegs. I don't know, to me it's not horrendous for a relatively short stint, but as always these things really do creep in and become more noticeable and perhaps annoying if you're doing lots and lots and lots of miles, and if you own this bike for years and you're maybe commuting a good distance every day, or you like to do tours. Of course that's where you're going to really find out about it and whether you can put up with it. We get most bikes, well, 1 a week basically for press bikes, and of course some of that's filming, some's editing, so I won't be doing a tour on it. We try and get as many miles as possible, but yeah, I don't find it absolutely terrible. Now, the other thing I've noticed as well is that sometimes it can be worse on one peg than the other. I've noticed that with quite a few bikes actually, and on this bike the left seems a little more buzzy. Suppose that depends on how the engine's specifically laid out. This bike has such a short side stand. It always feels like it's going to go over. I'd probably get an extension if I owned one, if that was possible. Shame as well, because it's like a nicely designed thing. There's lots of nice little details on this bike, and that's one of them. But it is a bit on the short side. Now, let's stick these rubbers in. Some of them just pull out or push back in. This is a little bit more of a process. I've got 2 Allen keys, a 4 and a 5mm. I've got all the bolts, hopefully. So the rubber goes in the top. Hopefully that's the right one. I think they're symmetrical. And then you've got this metal bar underneath. There we go. 5mm in the middle. And then 2 4s. Very comprehensive. They certainly won't just jump out without you noticing. Where's the 4mm? Other side now. Pop that one in. You know, a sort of secondary side effect to that side stand being short is that it takes a bit more effort to pick it up off the side stand, and it sort of gives you a perception that the bike's actually heavier than it really is. It's only a couple hundred kilos, but it just takes a bit of a hike up off the stand. Immediately that is actually substantially better with these rubbers. They are quite soft, and I notice when you stand up on them, you know, they do squish around quite a lot and feel a bit mushy, so you'd almost certainly want to have them out if you are off-roading. But yeah, on the road there's a big improvement there. Even with those hard accelerations up towards the red line there, it just takes the edge off. And whereas I said it felt kind of direct from the engine to the sole of your boot earlier, now there is a sense of like damping. So at 60th in 6th now, with the middle of my foot on the pegs, like I say, kind of flat-footed on them, you know, it still does feel fairly vibey, but if I move my foot back a little bit onto the balls, and they're just touching the front edges of those rubbers, I think that would be acceptable if you can kind of sustain this position, and that's how you kind of like to have your feet on the pegs. 70th in 6th, again, whole boot on the peg, you do start to feel it. The front of the peg on the balls of your feet, much more tolerable. Basically, putting those rubbers in, you know, I was saying the seat's not too bad in terms of vibes, bars moderate, and then the foot pegs were, you know, on the high end. The rubbers kind of make the sensation through the bars and the pegs feel kind of similar. Especially with your feet towards the front of the peg, I'd put it at like, still not bad through the seat, still moderate through the grips, and then sort of moderate to high rather than a flat out high through the pegs, depending on where your feet are and where you are in the rev range. Anyway, let's go and pick up this other bike that I think will make a great comparison and see how it feels in a similar scenario. Here we go then. Svartpillen 401, also a 400cc liquid cooled single. It's a little bit more revvy and a bit more peak power focused, and I'd say a bit less torquey, but should serve as a decent comparison. Although I should add that this is on the standard road pegs, so realistically this is predominantly a road bike. There might be grippy off-road pegs in the accessories catalogue, but yeah, a little bit of metal, a little bit of rubber. Don't think you can take it off. But there you go. Now look, I don't think you can quite beat a proper back-to-back ride like this in terms of comparing some of these specific sensations. And so I'm lucky to have a bike with such a similar engine. And I've got to say, overall this bike feels tighter, firmer. You know, it's going to be sharper in the handling. It's not as off-road biased as something like a Himalayan. The seat padding's a little bit firmer. The suspension feels that little bit more taut. And so I feel like the engine's making similar vibes, but I'm maybe getting a bit more of them, certainly through the saddle, and the pegs are pretty similar. A little less through the handlebars perhaps, and I was just looking to see if they're rubber mounted. That's something that we're seeing increasingly on bikes that suffer from vibes, like the Triumph Tiger 1200 with its cross-plane triple cylinder engine that does produce at cruising speeds some fairly irritating vibes through the handlebars. So yeah, for this year they've rubber mounted those, which maybe is ever so slightly detrimental to the handling. I wouldn't say you'll notice a big difference on bikes with those. But yeah, it should help a little bit in terms of making it more comfortable. But this bike is, from what I can see, mounted straight onto the top yoke, no damping, and yet the grips, they just don't feel quite as zingy. But everywhere else, seat and pegs, yeah, definitely more through the seat. We're doing 50 in 6th gear, equal through the pegs, so let's see what it's like on the motorway. This bike is so much fun. It's every bit the sort of baby KTM experience. Like, it's lively on the throttle, it revs up nicely, it's got the quick shifter fitted as standard, so you just snick through, oh, for God's sake, snick through the gears nicely. Like I say, it's not as torquey as the Himalayan, which is why I think I was just stalling it, pulling away there. You'll notice the shift light rather, is flashing on and off because at around 6,500 RPM, while this bike is being run in, it's got a much lower shift light. I can probably turn that off, but we're right on the sweet spot here of having it constantly flickering because we're doing 70-ish, and that's around 6,500 RPM, which presumably where it's set. I'm gonna say this bike maybe smooths out a little bit around here. It's as vibey at those lower speeds, and maybe when you're accelerating hard and going up through the rev range, but I think it smooths out a little bit here. I don't think it's quite as bad. I'd also say the difference between having your feet flat on the pegs and then having them on the edge of the pegs isn't as great. There's not as big a variation as the Himalayan because the pegs are smaller, I guess, so there's less of a variation in surface area on your boot. If your heels fold in and touch the heel guards, there's a lot through there. But yeah, in a normal road riding position, just on the sort of outsides of the pegs there, mid to ball of your foot, this is actually surprising me. I thought it was going to be more vibey. Having ridden this bike so far, you know, quite a bit, getting used to it. I noticed it's quite a buzzy engine. But yeah, whereas I'd say the Enfield is smoother in the lower revs and then gets more notably buzzy, this I feel like is buzzier in the lower revs and then actually feels kind of acceptable at these higher RPMs. So look, let me run back through that for you. If you're riding off-road, of course you're going to want those rubbers out for the extra grip, but it's massively worth popping them back in every time you're riding on the road if you can be bothered to put all 6 bolts back in, because it really does bring the vibes down from quite an intense level down to something much more acceptable. Then if you're using this bike predominantly around town with those rubbers in, I think it's totally fine, and it's only when you get on the motorway up to 70 that it might start to get a bit irritating, especially if you ride fully flat-footed on the middle of the peg there. If you're used to a single, maybe it's not going to be too bad, but if you do demo one of these and find it a touch irritating, perhaps consider a 390 Adventure, because if you're looking for a mid-capacity adventure bike to go predominantly road touring and that sort of thing, then I think it's just slightly better balanced up at 60 and 70 miles per hour. For everything else though, this is a lovely bike, nice and torquey, it's got lots of capability with that real off-road spec, nice new tech package, good finish, I like the way it looks as well, it's a much better looking bike than a 390 Adventure, and so I'd wholeheartedly recommend it. It's just if you're particularly sensitive to vibes, ride flat-footed, and you're pretty much going to be sat at 70 for most of your riding, then it's certainly something to think about. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next video.